In Climate Watch, a new UN report is raising alarms over massive changes to the world's oceans due to climate change. More than 100 scientists spent the last 3 years looking at how the Earth's warming is impacting people and the environment.
They say severe damage from rising sea levels and melting glaciers is all but inevitable.
Mark Phillips joins us now with more on this from Monaco, where scientists gathered to release the report. Not a bad place to gather, just as a side note, if you're going to get some pretty heavy information. So what did this report focus on, and how is it different from previous reports that we've seen from the IPCC?
This report concentrated on the oceans, which is, I suppose, one of the reasons they held the announcement of it here in Monaco, that and the fact that the Prince Albert wanted it to be here and spent some money for it. And it concentrated as well on what they call the cryosphere, which is the Earth's frozen regions, the North Pole, the South Pole, and high mountain tops. And its main conclusions were that although these areas have been subject to climate change over the decades and centuries, they've reached the point now where they can't take the change anymore, and the severe consequences for humanity and for the rest of the world in low-lying coastal regions and people who work on the sea and people who even work on the land, because there will be effects on drinking water and irrigation water as well. A lot of those are already in the system. How severe those consequences are will depend on how much carbon dioxide we continue to pump into the atmosphere, and the report talks in terms of high emission scenarios and lower emission scenarios. But basically they're saying that in the past, where reports have talked about projections about climate change, now we're actually seeing the effects of climate change, and the question is not so much when or if it'll happen, but how bad these consequences will be.
And so, Mark, who's expected to be affected by some of these changes? Are we talking, all of us, or initially certain parts of the planet?
Well, some parts of the planet are more vulnerable than others. If you live in a low-lying coastal region, no matter where you are in the world, there's a projected 1 meter, a little over a yard of sea level rise by the end of the century already projected into the system. And so the question at this stage becomes less one of mitigation, of how you limit it, because that's already there, and more about adaptability. And the report talks a lot about that as well, and about various scenarios, various approaches, seawalls, moving populations, reinforcements here and there, that kind of thing, to keep the sea back. But the sea will rise. That's already in the system, and that's what the report underlines.
Any suggestions as to how we handle this? Any remedies?
There are a lot of remedies, and the report goes into great detail about what the consequences of the various approaches will be, whether you have to relocate large populations along low-lying coasts. Again, that depends on how much rise there is and how much carbon dioxide continues, greenhouse gases continue to be pumped into the atmosphere. And it talks about the social consequences of those sorts of movements if they need to happen, the economic consequences and that kind of thing. It talks about if you build, as they are doing here, for example, sea defenses to guard against rising waters, and these aren't waters that just rise and stay there. If you put another foot or two of sea level rise, which may well happen over the next 50 years or so, and more in the latter half of the century, then you're more vulnerable when the storms happen. And one of the predictions, of course, is that there will be more severe storms. One of the scientists, an American who worked on one of the reports here, was telling me yesterday that the way your grandfather used to tell you, there was a big flood here 80 years ago, what happened? Well, that may be a 5-year or a 1-year event going forward instead of an 80-year event.
Really important reporting there, including that report on climate change. Mark Phillips for us in Monaco. Thank you, Mark.